All right. Can you hear me now? Totally my fault. On-off switches have me confused. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to week 4 of Evolution Is. Let me begin by reminding you again what evolution is, what our definition is. It's really important to keep focused on this because this is what we're discussing. If you have someone who is a proponent of evolution, it is really important that you make them understand this is what they believe and this is what you're arguing against. Evolution is the belief that all living organisms have a single common ancestor which itself came from non-living matter. The first week I talked about the fact that evolution is unbiblical. The second week I talked about the fact that many of the arguments that are used in support of evolution are illogical. And last week I started talking about the fact that many of the arguments that are used for evolution are in fact unscientific. And I want to expound on that today. So this point's going to take another 2 weeks probably. Last week I spent almost the entire time talking about the fact that evolution has no mechanism. That is a surprise for a lot of people. Evolution was around before the time of Darwin. What Darwin did is he suggested a mechanism for evolution. The mechanism he suggested was natural selection. He didn't demonstrate that natural selection could do anything. He just suggested that it could, and a lot of people accepted that, bought into it, and evolution became wildly popular at that point. The mechanism that he suggested, of course, was natural selection, and so we spent a lot of time looking at examples of natural selection last week. But the point that I was trying to make was that natural selection cannot be the mechanism for evolution, and in fact, knowledgeable evolutionists, in fact, know this is true. Natural selection is a pruning process. It's removing information. It never, ever creates anything. You can look at the examples that they give. Either you end up with exactly the same things that you started with, or in most cases, you actually lose some genetic information in the process of natural selection. So this is an important slide, and it says pretty much what you need to know about natural selection. Natural selection may be able to explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. What evolution has a problem with is explaining where anything new comes from. It's really important that in our minds, we always associate natural selection with evolution, but they're not the same thing. So it's important to keep in mind evolution is that definition I gave you at the beginning. And that's what we're arguing against. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you're arguing against natural selection, and that's all the person has to do is convince you that natural selection is true and therefore evolution is true. No, that's not what this argument is about. The argument is about the fact that they believe that all living things are related to each other and that first living thing came from a non-living matter. And that's what we're arguing against. So they don't have any explanation for the arrival of any novelty. I want to expound on this today with point number 2 under evolution is unscientific. Evolution cannot give a scientific explanation for the origin of any biological novelty. Instead, it relies on storytelling. I think we'll get to storytelling today, and we'll keep the magic for next week. Okay. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. If you believe in evolution, you have to have some kind of an explanation for where the first life forms came from. You have to. You know you have to. And so here is Isaac Asimov. If you're aware of who he was a science fiction writer, but a science writer as well. And he wrote this one time. Once upon a time, very long time ago, perhaps 2.5 billion years ago, under a deadly sun, in an ammoniated ocean topped by a poisonous atmosphere in the midst of a soup of organic molecules, a nucleic acid molecule came accidentally into being that could somehow bring about the existence of another like itself, and from that, all else would follow. Right, now, I'm glad he started this little story here with once upon a time because this is a fairy tale. It truly is, but this passes for science, and things like what he just wrote show up in science textbooks all the time. So how exactly do they believe that the first living life form came about? Well, I want to talk to you about the Yuri Miller experiments. It strikes me that this was now almost 70 years ago. So they've been doing these types of experiments I'm going to tell you about now for about 70 years. Yuri and Miller were two scientists that were working together, and what they did is they decided to take some chemicals that they felt were part of the early atmosphere of the Earth. You can see what they were in the middle there. It says CH4, which is methane, NH3, which is ammonia, H2, hydrogen, and H2O, water. They put these things in a flask, and this is all a self-contained apparatus here. It's a cycle. They boiled these chemicals. Of course, when they boiled, they became vapor, and they went up into the This is going counterclockwise around this picture. Eventually, it ended up in that globe over there in the upper right, and there were electrodes in the globe, and they fired the electrodes with an electric spark. I guess that's supposed to represent lightning of some kind. Then they condensed the gases, cooled the gases so that they condensed, and what they were able to produce at the bottom on the right, it says small organic molecules. In fact, what they were able to produce were amino acids. You cannot imagine how excited they were about this. This was not a particularly difficult experiment for them to do, and yet very quickly they were able to produce what they considered to be incredibly important molecules in terms of the beginning of life. And so I think if you even read some of the things that were written about this time, they pretty much expected that it was just, they clearly had figured out how this worked. They were going to obviously have to do some more experiments, but it would just be a matter of time, and they would be able to sort of create life in the laboratory. At least I think that's what their thinking was. Well, it's been 70 years now. How have they done? They've been doing these kinds of things. Actually, not so much anymore, although there are some people that work on this all the time. But it was very, very popular at the beginning because everybody wanted to be the one that did it, right? That was able to show that this worked. But not so much anymore. So let me talk to you about what's happened in the years since then. First of all, this is from the perspective of an evolutionist. I'm calling this the good news, right? They have been able to do some things. The first thing, there are 20 amino acids that are essential amino acids in life, and they've been able to produce all 20 amino acids in Miller-like experiments. That's Miller-like, not Miller-Lite experiments, okay? So all 20 of them they've produced. Also, this is also good news from their perspective, they've also been able to produce some other important organic compounds in experiments of this type, fatty acids and sugars and things like ATP, really important things for life. And so they've been able to create some of these things. So that sounds pretty good. And let me tell you, when they write this up in the Origin of Life chapter in the textbook, they make this sound like this is amazing. It's just what we have done and accomplished is so great. What they don't tell the people in that chapter is what they have not been able to do. So here's some of the bad news. First of all, the compounds that are produced are dependent upon the starting materials and experimental conditions. So if they start with certain conditions, they can produce some of the amino acids, but if they want to produce other amino acids, then they have to start with completely different conditions. No single experiment produces all the amino acids. Well, that's a problem because you need them all. You can't have some of them. They all got to be there if you're going to somehow put these things together, chain them together, and create life. Carbohydrates and amino acids are never produced under the same conditions. But of course, you need both of these things in order to get somewhere. So again, they can't do the whole thing with the same starting condition. That's a problem. Some biological relevant molecules have never been produced or have not been produced in any substantial amount. So, if there are some things you have to have and you don't have them, if they're necessary and you don't have them, then you can't get any further. But it gets a lot worse than this. So here's where it gets a little bit technical, and I'm not trying to overwhelm you with the details, but it turns out that amino acids have two each amino acid has two shapes associated with it. They call them the left hand and the right hand. They're actually mirror images of each other. And they are produced in these experiments in equal numbers. The problem is that on the Earth, pretty much exclusively, you only have the left-handed amino acids found in living things. So essentially, think about it this way. If you've got to put maybe 200 of these together in the right order in order to get a protein, and they all have to be left-handed, but there's equal number of left and right out there, and they're equally reactive, like whatever floats along is going to be the one that connects. It would be as if you picked up a coin and you said, I'm going to tell you what the flip is going to be, right? Because it's 50-50, and you said it's going to be heads, and you flipped it, and it's heads, right? Well, that's not a surprise. Can you do that 200 times in a row and be right every single time? Because you have to be. Now, mathematically, they're done at this point. I don't even have to go on. But I will go on because it actually is worse than this. So, number 4, many non-biological substances are also produced in these experiments. Without human intervention, these other substances will react readily with the biological relevant building blocks to form biological irrelevant compounds, a chemical insoluble sludge. So what they actually have in that was a circle, a closed circle there that they were boiling, and it went up and came around. They actually had a way to tap into that, and they would pull out those little organic molecules that were appearing at the bottom. They would pull them out. And the reason they started to do that is they didn't at first. And if you don't, they disappear. They don't hang around because they're very reactive. They'll react with anything. And some piece of junk would come along and they would react to it. And so essentially what you got was sludge. They believed this so much, they actually had some people going out and looking in different places around the world to see if they could find the biological sludge that has to be there if, in fact, this is how life formed in the first place, because in all their experiments, the sludge is formed. So they tap it, they intervene in the process, and they take things out as they're produced. Only short wavelength ultraviolet light is used. Why is that? Because short-wave ultraviolet light quickly degrades the amino acids. So you all know that the sun is essential for our life, but you also probably know that the sun would kill us if it weren't for something called the ozone layer. And the ozone layer is, it's O3, it's oxygen, but it's an unusual type of oxygen, and it's in the upper atmosphere, and it's protecting us from cosmic radiation that would, in fact, be very damaging and would kill us. There was no ozone layer when in the early atmosphere of the Earth, according to the evolutionists. So what happens is that anything that was created, if something somehow managed to get created, it wouldn't hang around. It would be zapped and would be gone. And so they know that, and so what they do is they go, well, we won't use all of the wavelengths of light that are coming from the sun. We'll just use some of them in our experiments. Well, why are they doing that? Because if they used everything, then it would be the end of the experiment. So human intervention is being used here as well. And then, this is just one more example. Phosphates must be added to the flask in order to get ATP. They don't have any explanation for why there should be phosphates or where the phosphates come from or why they should be there. It's just we need them to get the ATP. We really want to get the ATP, so what are we going to do? We're going to pour in phosphates. All right, so if you look at the three things that are here, right, what do you notice that they're doing? They're intervening in the experiments, right? This is, you could call it cheating. They're supposed to be doing experiments that are modeling how life formed, they consider eons ago there was no plan, there was no designer, there was just natural processes that were occurring, and then somehow life came about. And yet, when they model this, at every stage of the experiment, they're intervening in the process to make it work the way they want it to work. So this is not a true model of what they think was back there. But why do they do this? They have no choice. If they don't do this, the experiment will be a complete and utter failure. All right, so even though they do cheat, cook the books, intervene in the whole process, they still have accomplished next to nothing. As I said, when they write this up in the textbooks, it'll sound glorious. It'll sound like they've accomplished all kinds of things. They have people, and I've even asked students, how close do you think they are to actually creating life in the laboratory? Like, do you think they're going to do it in the next week, in the next month? Are they almost? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think they're almost there. There's just a few more little tweaks they have to make. All right, so I'll ask you, how far have they come towards creating life in the laboratory? Are they 50% of the way there? Are they 75%? Are they 25%? Yeah, they're at 0%. Okay, a realistic evaluation of what they have done so far up to this point is they have done nothing. 70 years and they have done nothing. So let me explain why. Here's a picture that maybe you can keep into your brain. I try to give you a visual to remember. Let's say I was going to make this house here, right? I think of building life forms. It's a very complicated house, not as complicated as life forms, but okay, use this to visualize what a life form would be like. They're trying to build this house, doing experiments, and it's a beautiful, big, beautiful, well-designed brick house, and they cannot make a brick. And that's where they are in this whole process. They can't make a brick. See, they talk about these amino acids as if they are the building blocks of life. They are not the building blocks of life. The building blocks of life are proteins. The amino acids are the building blocks of the proteins. So what they have done up to this point is they've been able to create some of the building blocks of the building blocks of life. And that's all they've been able to do. So that's the status right now. I wish they would tell people this in the classes, but they don't. They make it sound like they're pretty close to getting where they want to be, but they're really not at all. Now, some of you may have heard of somebody named Dean Kenyon, but let me tell you a little bit about him in case you have not. In the 1960s, Dean Kenyon was an origin of life researcher. He was considered one of the premier origin of life researchers. He wrote a book called Biochemical Predestination. It was sort of considered like the Bible for origin of life researchers. And he said in that book, this was sort of the premise of his book, life may have been biochemically predestined by the properties of attraction that exist between its chemical parts, particularly between the amino acids and the proteins. So let me explain what he was saying. This is a very prevalent view among evolutionists. They don't just believe that life could have formed this way. They believe that life must have formed this way, that life didn't have any choice. It was predestined in the molecules for life to occur. This is why every time they turn around and they find water somewhere, what do they think they're going to find there as well? Life. Right? Because, if you got the molecules and it's predestined in the molecules, if you just understood the chemical attraction between certain biological molecules, you would recognize that they are more likely to attract in a way that is positive towards life than attach in a way that is negative toward life. So it's like life had no choice. Like the molecules were just going to find each other. It's almost like a probability argument. The molecules are going to find each other, and they're going to arrange each other in the right way because that's what they're most likely going to do. And these amino acids are going to become the proteins that we need, and then we're going to have the building blocks of life, and then somehow life will occur. Well, that was his argument. So what a lot of people don't know is that Dean Kenyon spent the next decades of his life trying to verify that he was in fact right. He would test the strength of the bonds between different amino acids, ones that were useful towards life, ones that were not useful. His thought process was it would very easily become clear that the bonds that were more useful to life would be the stronger bonds and the ones that were more likely to occur. And in fact, in the process of trying to prove that he was right, he proved to himself that he was wrong. Yeah, proved himself that he was wrong. This idea is a very prevalent idea, even today, among evolutionists. But here's what Dean Kenyon said in 2002. We have not the slightest chance of a chemical evolutionary origin for even the simplest of cells. Now, this is a guy, in some ways I feel bad for him, and this was his life work. And he spent his life doing this, and basically at the end of his research, he came to the conclusion, I wasted my time. Because we've gotten nowhere, and we don't have any ideas on how to get anywhere. All right, well, that's not something you see published in textbooks very often, is it? So how do evolutionists deal with this? Because honestly, they know that the origin of life is a losing argument. They have to have an explanation for it, but they know it's a losing argument. I've talked to biologists that have told me to my face that they wish the origin of life chapter in the biology textbooks was removed. It's really a chapter in creative writing, but it's not a science chapter, and they didn't feel like it should be there. But you'll notice it's still there. Why? They have to have something. You have to have an explanation for something, and that's the best explanation they have, and they're going to sugarcoat it, and they're going to give it to you whether you like it or not. So here is how they normally deal with the fact that they really don't have an explanation for the origin of life. They just say, that's another issue. That's not really what we're worried about. Niles Eldredge is a good example. The question of the origin of life is separate from the issue of what happened to life after it arose. So he says, chemical evolution, yeah, we don't really understand that, but biological evolution, we really got a handle on that. So somehow life formed. We don't know how, but somehow life formed. But once it formed, boom, then the whole process took off. So that's really how they deal with it. I'll show you another example. This is from a little, like a cartoon kind of thing, but here's Darwin, and he's saying, the origin of life itself, oh, it's not really my bag. The origin of species is where it's at. So again, he's saying, yeah, we got a good handle on biological evolution. Chemical evolution, yeah, we really don't understand that at all. But here's the problem. They go together. You can't have biological evolution until you have chemical evolution first. And so you have to have an explanation. And that is why they will never take that chapter out of the textbook, even though they know that for the most part, it's a story. All right, so let's talk about the diversity of life. Let's move along and see why this is a problem actually for them as well, even though this one they think they have a much stronger handle on. Charles Darwin, I will give him credit for this. Charles Darwin was willing to critique his own theory. He would probably get in trouble today from evolutionists because they do not allow any critique of neo-Darwinism. But Darwin did. And he even wrote several different critiques of his theory. And one of the things he wrote was the following: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. I agree with him at this point. If there is something that cannot be explained by a series of successive slight modifications, then evolution is wrong. Do we have any candidates for complex organs of this type? Hundreds. Okay. Now, Darwin wouldn't have understood all this in his lifetime because, we didn't have real good microscopes and a real good understanding of biology at that point, but we have a much better understanding today, and now we realize the depth of the problems that they have. Let me give you an example. I talked to you about DNA before, and I talked about how they don't really have an explanation for the origin of DNA. They should, but they don't. They just admit that, yeah, it's a real hard problem. But DNA is a code. Now, I actually am a code expert, and I can tell you that there is no such thing as a code that was not created by an intelligent being. It doesn't exist. There's none, not a single example. Now, several years ago, I was having a conversation with Eugenie Scott. And Eugenie Scott is a really important evolutionist. She used to be the head of a group that they called themselves the National Center for Science Education, but really they were just an evolution front group. They only had one issue they cared about, and their issue was evolution. And I got the opportunity to ask Eugenie, can you give me an example of a code that was not created by an intelligent being? She didn't flinch, she didn't falter. She immediately turned to me and said, DNA. Immediate response. Okay, well, that is just mind-boggling because DNA is the most complex code in the universe. The most complex code in the universe. And here, she just passes it off and says, yeah, all the other codes, they were all created by an intelligent being. All the ones that are less complex. But here, the most complicated code in the universe, this is the one that was created by natural processes that did not involve intelligence at all. That doesn't make any sense at all. So I'll tell you a story. Years ago, I was walking along the shore of Lake Michigan, and I picked up a rock, and this is what it had on the rock. There were 6 scratch marks. It looked like it said, hi. And I assumed that that's probably what it said. I assumed, I'll admit that I don't know for sure, but I assume that some person picked this up and scratched 6 scratch marks on there and left the message hi and left it on the shore. I took the rock home. I have it in my house somewhere today. But when I say I think that's what happened, I'm pretty sure, I would say I'm 95% sure that that's what happened. But I can't say I'm 100% sure, because is it possible that natural processes, wind and waves and rocks rubbing against other rocks, is it conceivable that there were some scratches put on this rock and I'm just interpreting them to be more than what they really are? Okay, maybe. I give it 5%. But I'm pretty heavily leaning towards, yeah, these 6 scratch marks tell me that some intelligent person put this on here. Now, let's do a theoretical experiment here for a second. Let's suppose I'm walking along the shores of Lake Michigan. I reach down, I pick up a rock, and it says on it, 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And it goes on, and it has the entire Gettysburg Address on this rock. Must be a big rock, right? Now, what would you say at this point? Was it created by an intelligent being, or did it come about by natural processes, waves and rocks and wind and all that? Which one? It was an intelligent process, right? Intelligent being created this. And how sure are you? 100%. No possibility of the other one, right? None. I don't care how many, is it 0.99999? I don't care how many nines you put, it's 100%. This is the difference between this and DNA. There is more than 600,000 times more information in every cell of your body than is contained in the Gettysburg Address. There is more than 600,000 times more information contained in every cell of your body than is contained in the Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address didn't appear on that rock by natural processes that did not involve intelligence, and the information that is packed into every cell of your body got there in the DNA because it was put there. It didn't come about by natural processes. And they have no explanation for this, and they have to. Because remember what Darwin said? If there's something that I can't explain through a series of numerous successive slight modifications, my theory is wrong. Let's keep looking at other examples of this. I'd like to watch a little video clip now. It's called Unlocking the Mystery of Life. This is a really good video. It's about an hour long, and we're not going to watch the whole thing, but there's a little animation in here that would be really worth your seeing. So I'm going to try to bring this up on YouTube. All right.
We have not the slightest chance of a chemical evolutionary origin for even the simplest of cells. So the concept of the intelligent design of life was immensely attractive to me and made a great deal of sense, as it very closely matched the multiple discoveries in molecular biology.
In the years since Kenyon's rejection of chemical evolution, science has revealed the details of an entire system of information processing that bears the hallmarks of intelligent design. With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the Earth.
Okay. So what you just saw, there is absolutely no evolutionary explanation for any of that. That's absolutely amazing to me. Darwin could be excused for not understanding this. In Darwin's day, when they looked at the cell, again, they didn't have very good magnification. They basically thought of a cell as a little baggie of Jell-O. They had no idea. We don't have that excuse today. Evolution has to explain everything that you just saw, and evolution can't explain anything of what you just saw. When you look at the cell that we're looking at here is called a eukaryotic cell. There are simpler cells. No life forms are simple, but there are simpler cells. They're called prokaryotic cells. Those are bacteria cells. And that's what evolutionists believe the first life must have been because, well, it's the simplest thing around. So the first living thing must have been something like that. But the gap between the bacteria cells and these cells is enormous. It's a giant chasm, and they have to have an explanation where everything you see comes from. In this cell, you have a transportation system, you have a power plant, you have a food distribution system, you have a manufacturing system, you have waste disposal system. Right? This is a miniature city. Every cell of your body is a miniature city, and it was created by God to do what it's doing. And there is no explanation other than that. And remember what Darwin said? He said, if there's anything that my theory can't explain, I'm wrong. Well, his theory can't explain this. Let me show you. The question is, how did the cell evolve? And I'm particularly thinking about eukaryotic cells. Let me give you an explanation from my biology textbook. In tracking the emergence of the eukaryotic cell, one enters a kind of wonderland where scientific pursuit leads almost to fantasy. Cell and molecular biologists must construct cellular worlds in their own imaginations. So this is how they explain. They just write stories. They just go, well, we can imagine this happen and we can imagine this happen. Why don't they go in the laboratory and test it? They totally would be wasting their time. They can't do any of these things. So they just write stories about it. You don't see this type of thing being presented in the biology textbook very often. So it looks to me like Darwin's theory has broken down, right? If we can come up with examples that he can't explain, then the theory is no good. Let me talk to you just for a moment about biochemistry. One of the most complex areas of study within biology is a subfield of biology which is known as biochemistry. I happen to believe that this is the most complicated part of biology. If you took chemistry class, some of you know the most difficult chemistry class is organic chemistry. So that's kind of looking at this from the other perspective. But in a recent survey of biochemistry textbooks, half of them never even mentioned evolution in the textbook. 1/4 of them mentioned evolution 3 times or less. Why isn't it everywhere in the textbook? Because, it's the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to an understanding of biology except through evolution. Well, they can't explain anything. They can't explain how any of it evolves, so they just don't even bother mentioning it. Let me show you what I'm talking about. There's 2 main areas here that I think are unbelievably complicated. First of all, cellular respiration. In one biology textbook I have, they have 20 pages on cellular respiration. This is not the respiration in your lungs. That's top level respiration. But this is talking about cellular respiration on the cellular level. And the difficult part of this is what you see on the right-hand side there. There's something called the Krebs Cycle. So if you have studied this in biology, you know this is ridiculously complicated. I think this is the hardest thing I've ever read about. But it's not the only aspect of this. You also have photosynthesis. 20 pages in my textbook on photosynthesis, and this is a gigantic biochemical process, which is what photosynthesis is. And the heart of it on the right-hand side is called the Calvin cycle. And it's complicated. I don't think it's as complicated as the Krebs cycle, but that's just my opinion. So this is really complicated stuff, and there's no explanation for this. And because they don't have an explanation, they just don't mention it, how any of this could have evolved when they put this in the textbooks. So I was talking to a friend of mine. This is a guy I grew up with, and who knew he was smart? I had no idea. Turned out that he ended up getting his PhD in biochemistry. He's a professor at a university today. And maybe I'll tell you some of the stories about him later on without mentioning his name, because I don't want him to lose his job. But I called him up when I read about this survey, and I said, well, that's really weird that they wouldn't even mention evolution in the textbooks, in the biochemistry textbooks. And so I read him about this survey, and he laughed, and then he said the following, and I said, say that again because I want to get it exactly right. This is what he said. He said, many biochemistry textbooks worship at the altar of Darwinism in chapter 1 and never mention evolution again in the textbook. So they say what they have to say about, evolution having to be true, and it explains everything, and then they don't use it to explain anything in the rest of the textbook because they can't explain anything in the rest of the textbook. So again, Darwin said, if there's something out there that my theory can't explain, he didn't understand any of this stuff, so he can be excused. But people today have no excuse anymore. But yet, they still prop up Darwinism as if it's the truth. I want to talk about butterflies just for a moment, because this is just another example, and it's a great example. I love talking about the butterflies. This is a monarch butterfly that you're looking at, but butterflies are really interesting to me. I don't know, you've all heard, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Okay, well, here's a question that's a real legitimate scientific question. What came first, the caterpillar or the butterfly? Well, clearly the caterpillar, right? Because, it's the first thing when the little egg hatches, it's a caterpillar, right? You got to have caterpillars before you can get the adult butterfly, right? But caterpillars don't reproduce. Butterflies reproduce. So you see the problem. You got a caterpillar that can't exist without a butterfly, and you got a butterfly that can't exist without a caterpillar. So if you're an evolutionist, you have to explain how both of these came at the same time. And they have no explanation for this. I mean, it's really, really difficult to explain. And the other thing is, the DNA of this organism has the structural information for creating both of these creatures, because they're really kind of 2 different creatures. The caterpillar, when it hatches, is basically an eating machine. That's really all it is. It's really tiny, and then it just goes around and it eats everything on the leaf, and then if it can get to another leaf, it eats everything on that leaf, and it just keeps going. Very destructive if you got a bunch of them on the same bush. And when it gets big and fat and can't hardly move anymore, it goes into a cocoon, right? It creates a cocoon. Do you know what happens in the cocoon? Did you ever squish a cocoon? Ugh. Juice will shoot all over the place, depending upon where it is in its cycle in the cocoon. But you get it in mid-cycle, it dissolves itself. It becomes sort of a bag full of chemicals, and then the DNA rebuilds a completely different creature inside there. And the cocoon breaks open, and there's your butterfly. Both of those creatures, I know they're one creature, but the two, they're very anatomically different from each other. And both of them, the same DNA has the information for both of them in it, and you've got to explain the whole package. And they can't. Let me tell you one more thing about the butterfly. The monarch in particular is what I'm thinking about here. The monarch is a traveling butterfly. So if you don't know anything about the story of the monarchs, it is absolutely fascinating. The monarchs are born in this, there's a generation of monarchs that are born in the spring in Mexico. Monarchs come from Mexico. And they're travelers. What they do is they go through their life cycle where they're caterpillars and they eat everything, and then they become eventually butterflies, and then what they do is they fly north. They fly a few hundred miles and they lay eggs and they die. They live about 3 weeks to 4 weeks total. And then there's another generation of caterpillar/monarch butterflies that are formed. And what do? They fly north. And they go a few hundred miles. They live 3 to 4 weeks and they die. But before they die, fortunately, they produce another generation of caterpillar/monarch butterflies that does the same thing. And each generation moves several hundred miles to the north. And sometime during the late summer, monarch butterflies will start showing up here in the Springfield area. They do get this far north. They go further north. All right, this goes on for 4, 5, 6 generations. They just keep moving north, and each generation lasts for about 3 to 4 weeks. Then, around this time of year, a generation of monarch butterflies is born. This generation is called the Methuselah monarch butterflies, because they now fly all the way back to Mexico. They don't live for 3 to 4 weeks. They live much, much longer than that. That's why they call them the Methuselah. They fly all the way back to Mexico. Now, you have to have an evolutionary explanation for that, because Darwin says evolution explains everything or it explains nothing. You have to explain how this 5th or 6th generation of monarch butterflies somehow lived longer than all the generations preceding it. Right? How did that happen? How did that genetic, it's obviously important for the survival of the species, but it's not. But this is something that skips over multiple generations. The other generations didn't get this. It's just the one generation that gets it. And not only that, not only do you have to explain how this generation just happens to live longer, how did they find their way home? Because they go back to Mexico to the same fields that their ancestors came from, 8 months earlier. And you got to explain all of this. And all that information has bypassed multiple generations of butterflies, and then all of a sudden it kicks in. It's clearly there, in the genetic information somehow that we think we understand. We don't understand. We don't have a clue. We're going to spend the next 1,000 years, if Christ doesn't come back, trying to decode the DNA, because there's an awful lot there that we just do not understand. But somewhere in there is this information, and it's not activated for generation after generation, and all of a sudden it's activated just the way it needs to be, and they fly all the way back to where they came from. Once again, this is something that evolution cannot explain. So I'll end today with this. For since the creation of the world, I read this before, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Okay, see you next week.